Welcome to Warhammer 40,000 Lore to Sleep To. Today we'll be exploring the origins and other details of Lorgar, Primarch of the word-bearers Legiones Astartes. So lie back, relax, and let's begin. In the long and shadowed history of the Imperium, there are 18 names that stand above all others, names spoken with reverence, with fear, with sorrow, depending on who utters them and in what age, and in what corner of the galaxy the telling takes place. Among these names, one carries a particular weight, a particular strangeness, a quality that sets him apart even from his most extraordinary brothers. Unlike them, he was not first known as a warrior. He was Lorgar, Primarch of the 17th Legion, the legion that the wider galaxy would come to know, and in time to fear, as the word-bearers. His was a different kind of greatness, one measured not in conquests claimed, or worlds subdued by force of arms, but in something far harder to grasp, something that lived quietly in the space between belief and certainty, between a question asked and an answer finally found. On Colchis, the world that raised him before the Emperor came to reclaim him as a son, Lorgar was given a title that the people spoke with something close to worship, a title that followed him through every chapter of his long and complicated life. They called him Urizen, a word from the old Colchisian tongue meaning wisest of the wise. It was not a name granted lightly, and it was certainly not a name granted to a child. It was a name that grew slowly, year upon year, from a people watching a boy become a man who could silence a restless crowd with a single sentence, who could turn doubt into devotion with nothing more than the cadence of his voice and the conviction behind his eyes. Where other worlds might have raised a soldier, Colchis raised something closer to a living scripture, a man whose every word seemed to carry the weight of prophecy even before anyone could say for certain what that prophecy foretold. His brothers, scattered as they were across 100 different worlds and 100 different fates, became warlords in their own right. They were conquerors, strategists, butchers and statesmen, each one shaped by the world that raised him, into something fit for the long and bloody work of galactic conquest. Some became masters of war who knew no equal on the battlefield. Others became architects of empire, builders of order from chaos, men who measured their worth in the territories they claimed for the Emperor and the enemies they broke beneath their heel. Lorgar was shaped into something else entirely, something that did not fit easily alongside his brothers, no matter how hard he tried in those early years to make himself fit. Long before he ever led armies into battle, Lorgar was a philosopher, a prophet, an orator whose gift for words could move multitudes to tears or to zealotry within the very same breath. He did not seek victory first, not in the way his brothers understood victory. He sought meaning, an answer to the question that gnawed at him from his earliest days of awareness, a question that no amount of conquest could ever hope to satisfy. It was the question of what, in this vast and largely indifferent galaxy, was truly worth believing in. What deserved a man's devotion? What deserved his worship? It was a question that would follow him from the dusty streets of Colchis to the marble halls of the Emperor's palace, and from there, out into the endless dark between the stars, never fully answered, never fully laid to rest. It was this search, this relentless and unsatisfied hunger for absolute truth, that would one day reach further than any single battlefield victory ever could. For Lorgar's quest, born in quiet contemplation on a dusty world far from the Emperor's light, far from the gleaming towers of terror and the certainties they seemed to promise, would not stay quiet for long. It would grow within him, slowly at first, then with gathering speed, twisting through doubt and devotion and disillusionment in turn, until at last it erupted outward across the stars themselves. What might have remained, in other hands, a war between brothers, a civil conflict fought over politics and pride and the future shape of an empire, became instead something far older, far stranger, and far more dangerous than any of his kin could have foreseen. It became a holy war. A war of belief itself, fought not merely for territory or for power but for the very soul of a galaxy uncertain of what it ought to worship. And at the center of it all, neither fully villain nor fully tragic victim, stood the Primarch who had simply wanted to know what was true, who had only ever wanted to find something worthy of the faith burning so fiercely within him, and who would, in his search, set the entire Imperium alight in ways from which it would never fully recover. A child of faith. Long before he was given the title of Primarch, long before any battle line bore his name, long before the galaxy learned to fear or revere him in equal measure, Lorgar was simply a small vessel falling through the endless dark, a single capsule among many scattered across the breadth of the stars by forces and intentions still only half understood even by those who set them in motion. 18 suns, 18 capsules, 18 worlds waiting somewhere ahead in the silence to receive them, each world entirely unaware of what it was about to be given, or what the gift would eventually cost. His capsule did not land on a world of steel cities or marching armies, nor on some forgotten frontier hewn from rock and ambition. It landed on Colchis, a world unlike almost any other in the Emperor's growing dominion, a world where the ordinary business of survival had long since become tangled with something deeper, something older, something that pulsed beneath the surface of daily life like a second heartbeat. Colchis was a theocracy in the truest and most literal sense of the word. It was not governed by armies in the way so many worlds were governed, nor by bloodlines passed from father to son in halls of polished stone. It was governed by prophecy. It was governed by scripture. It was governed by the endless and often violent competition between faiths, each one certain, with the unshakable certainty only true believers can possess, that they alone held the truth of existence within their sacred texts and their whispered rites. Priests held more power than soldiers on Colchis. Temples rose higher than fortresses. Children were taught the names of gods before they were taught the names of kings, and disputes between rival sects could erupt into bloodshed as readily as any border war waged elsewhere in the galaxy. It was, in hindsight, perhaps the only world in the entire breadth of the Emperor's dominion, strange enough, devout enough, and hungry enough for meaning, to have shaped the man Lorgar would eventually become. No forge world could have made him. No war world could have understood him. Only Colchis, with its dust and its prophecies and its endless searching for something larger than itself, could have given the galaxy a Primarch built not from steel but from belief. The stories of his arrival vary depending on who tells them, as is so often the case with events that later generations come to regard as sacred, events that grow new details with each retelling, each storyteller adding a fragment of meaning the original moment may never have possessed. The most enduring account, the one repeated most often in the years that followed, speaks of rain. On a world where water was scarce and precious, where the skies were more often choked with dust and ash than with cloud, where farmers prayed for rain the way other worlds prayed for victory in war, rain fell in great sweeping sheets on the very day his capsule was discovered. It came suddenly, without warning, without the usual signs that the local priests had learned to read in the sky, over generations. It simply fell, as though the heavens themselves had taken notice of what had quietly landed among the people of Colchis, as though some greater hand had decided that this arrival deserved to be marked, deserved to be witnessed by something larger than the dry and dusty ground. The locals who found him, awed and unsettled in equal measure, gathered around the strange capsule and the stranger child within it, and they began almost immediately to speak of him in hushed tones reserved for omens and portents. They began to call him by a name that would follow him for the rest of his childhood, a name that would cling to him long after he had grown into something far greater than the infant they had first discovered in the mud. They called him Raincaller, a title given not in mockery but in something closer to wonder, the first small sign that this child was not entirely of their world, even as he would grow, in time, to belong to it more completely and more painfully than almost any of them could have imagined. The name spread through the surrounding settlements within days. Within weeks, travelers from neighboring regions were arriving, simply to see the child for themselves, to look upon the boy the rains had welcomed into the world. The fate of the tribe that first took him in is less certain, and far darker, shrouded in the kind of ambiguity that tends to surround the early lives of men who later become legends. Some accounts, passed down through whispered retellings and contested histories, claim that the very people who discovered him, the very tribe that fed him and sheltered him and gave him his first name, were soon after destroyed entirely. Slaughtered, according to these darker tellings, by mercenaries acting in the pay of a man named Corferan, a man whose ambition stretched far beyond the simple borders of any one tribe or settlement. If these accounts are to be believed, the infant Lorgar was left as the sole survivor of his own adoptive people, plucked from the wreckage of a massacre orchestrated, whether directly or indirectly, by the very man who would go on to raise him as his own. Whether this is truth or later embellishment, myth shaped to suit the purposes of those who told it in later years, perhaps to lend Lorgar's rise an air of tragedy and destiny intertwined, remains difficult to untangle even now, so many years removed from the dust and confusion of those early days on Colchis. What is certain, what survives in every version of the tale regardless of how the details shift and blur, is that in the aftermath of whatever truly happened to that first tribe, it was Corferan who took the child as his own. And here, in this single act, the entire shape of Lorgar's future life was quietly set into motion, though no one watching at the time could have understood the full weight of what was beginning. Corferan was no ordinary guardian, no simple farmer or tribesman who happened upon an unusual child and decided, out of kindness or curiosity, to raise him. He had once been a priest within Colchis's covenant, a man steeped from his own childhood in scripture and ritual, trained in the long and demanding traditions of religious leadership that Colchis prized above almost anything else. But somewhere along the way, Corferan had fallen, or perhaps more accurately had climbed, into something far more ambitious and far less scrupulous than simple devotion. He had come to see faith not merely as a comfort or a guide but as a tool, a lever by which a clever and patient man might move entire populations according to his own design. He understood, perhaps better than anyone else on Colchis, the sheer power that belief could wield when properly directed, and when he found the child the reins had welcomed, he recognized in him something extraordinary, something that might, with the right shaping, with the right teaching, become more powerful than any weapon Colchis had ever produced. It was Corferan who raised Lorgar from infancy onward, who fed him not only food and shelter but ideas, doctrines, the slow and careful architecture of belief itself, brick by brick, year by year, until the boy's entire understanding of the world had been built upon a foundation Corferan himself had laid. Of all the influences that would shape Lorgar across his long and complicated life, none would prove as foundational, nor ultimately as dangerous, as those quiet years spent at Corferan's side, learning at his knee, absorbing his lessons the way dry ground absorbs rain. It was Corferan who first taught him to see the world as a stage upon which faith and power move together, inseparable, each lending strength to the other, neither one complete without its counterpart. It was a lesson Lorgar would carry with him for the rest of his existence, long after he had left Colchis behind, long after Corferan's own role in his life had become something far more complicated than simple guardianship. Under this guardianship, shaped by a man who understood the architecture of belief as intimately as an engineer understands the architecture of a fortress, Lorgar's education became something rich and unusually deep for a child of his circumstances. He was steeped in theology from his earliest years, taught to parse the dense and often contradictory scriptures of a dozen competing Colchisian sects, each with their own gods, their own prophets, their own claims to ultimate truth. He learned to find the threads of meaning that ran beneath the surface of these competing faiths, the patterns that suggested something larger and more coherent hiding behind the apparent chaos of Colchis's religious landscape. He studied philosophy alongside scripture, learning to ask the kind of questions that troubled wiser minds than his own, questions about purpose, about meaning, about the nature of divinity and the obligations it placed upon mortal beings. He was schooled in rhetoric, in the careful construction of an argument, in the patient art of bending language until it became not merely persuasive but almost irresistible, a tool capable of reshaping the convictions of an entire crowd within the span of a single speech. Even as a small child, long before he had the years or the experience to justify it, Lorgar displayed a charisma that unsettled those who witnessed it, a natural and effortless gift for drawing others toward whatever he believed, as though belief itself were contagious in his presence, as though simply standing near him was enough to make uncertain convictions feel suddenly, comfortingly solid. Adults twice and three times his age found themselves listening to him with an attention they would never have given another child, nodding along to ideas spoken in a small boy's voice as though they carried the weight of ancient wisdom. It troubled some of the elders of Colchis, this strange and premature authority. It comforted others, who saw in the boy something they had been waiting their entire lives to find. It was not only words that gave him this power, though words would remain his greatest gift throughout his long existence. Even as a boy, Lorgar possessed a strange and quiet sensitivity that set him apart from every other child on Colchis, a sensitivity that ran deeper than mere observation or empathy as ordinary people understood it. He seemed able to sense what others felt before they spoke it aloud, to perceive grief or hope or fear or devotion radiating from those around him as clearly as another child might notice the heat of a fire or the chill of a winter wind. He would sometimes fall silent in the middle of a crowded room, his attention drawn to some quiet sorrow in a stranger's heart that no one else had noticed, and he would cross the room without hesitation, to offer comfort no one had asked him for, comfort that nonetheless seemed to find exactly the wound it was meant to heal. This psychic empathy, this faint but undeniable gift, was the first true sign of the latent power that ran through him, a power his brothers across the galaxy would each come to know in their own different forms, expressed through their own different talents. It would not remain so faint for long. The gift first revealed itself fully, not in waking life, not in the crowded streets or temples of Colchis, but in dreams, vivid and recurring, the kind of dreams that leave a mark on a sleeping mind long after waking, the kind that linger at the edges of the day like a half-remembered melody. Night after night, across months and then years, Lorgar found himself drawn into visions of a being wreathed in gold, vast and radiant, a figure whose face he could never quite hold in memory upon waking but whose presence felt unmistakably real, unmistakably significant, a presence that seemed to watch over the unfolding of the galaxy itself from somewhere far beyond the reach of ordinary sight. He could not name this golden figure, not in those early years, but he could not forget him either, and the dreams returned again and again with a persistence that felt less like imagination and more like memory, as though some part of him had already lived this moment somewhere, sometime, and was only now beginning to remember it. Alongside this golden god came another recurring image, one that haunted his sleeping mind with equal persistence, the sense of a Messiah yet to come, a savior whose arrival Lorgar somehow knew, with the strange and unshakable certainty dreams sometimes carry, was both inevitable and close at hand. He dreamed of a reckoning, a moment when the scattered faiths of Colchis and perhaps of the entire galaxy would finally converge upon a single, unifying truth, and he dreamed that he himself stood somewhere near the center of that convergence, though the dreams never showed him precisely what role he was meant to play. These were not the idle dreams of an ordinary child drifting through the small fantasies of youth. They carried weight, conviction, a quality that made those who heard him describe them upon waking pause and consider carefully whether the boy was simply imaginative in the way clever children often are, or whether he had truly seen something real, something that existed beyond the borders of his own small mind. As word of these visions spread across Colchis, carried from settlement to settlement by travelers and traders and pilgrims eager to share such remarkable news, they did something that mere stories rarely manage to do. They divided a world already fractured by competing faiths into something sharper still, a true religious schism that ran through villages and even through families, setting brother against sister, parent against child. Some heard in Lorgar's dreams, a long-awaited confirmation of their own ancient prophecies, evidence that the Messiah their scriptures had promised for generations was finally drawing near, perhaps even standing among them already in the form of this remarkable child. Others heard only dangerous heresy, the ramblings of a boy whose strange gifts had perhaps unbalanced his mind, or worse, the deliberate manipulations of a guardian, eager to use his charged reputation for his own ends. The arguments grew heated in temples and marketplaces alike, and more than once threatened to spill over into open violence between rival factions who could agree on nothing except their conviction that the other side was utterly, dangerously wrong. Yet rather than being crushed beneath the weight of this growing controversy, as a lesser figure might well have been, Lorgar found himself instead, at its very center, and slowly, inexorably, almost without seeming to try, he began to draw people toward him rather than away. This was perhaps his greatest and strangest gift of all, more remarkable even than his empathy or his prophetic dreams, the simple fact that controversy itself seemed only to strengthen his position rather than weaken it. Where another figure might have been torn apart by such division, Lorgar absorbed it, transformed it, and turned it gradually into a foundation upon which something new could be built. He united tribes that had warred with one another for generations, over disputes so old that even the elders could no longer fully explain their origins, tribes whose ancient feuds had seemed permanent, unbreakable, woven into the very fabric of Colchisian life. Yet under Lorgar's growing influence, old enemies found themselves standing side by side, their ancient grievances quietly set aside in favor of something that felt, to those who experienced it, far more important than old grudges and territorial disputes. He drew in slaves who had known nothing but servitude their entire lives, men and women whose worlds had been bounded by the limits of their master's will, and gave them, for the first time in living memory, a banner worth following, a cause that promised something beyond mere endurance, something that felt, however vaguely defined, like genuine liberation. He gathered believers from every faction of Colchis's tangled and quarrelsome religious landscape, men and women who might otherwise have spent their entire lives as bitter rivals, certain in their mutual conviction that the other's faith was false, and yet who found in Lorgar something that somehow transcended their old divisions, something large enough to contain all their separate truths within a single greater truth. His popularity did not grow slowly or quietly, gathering momentum at the gentle pace of ordinary fame. It spread across Colchis with the speed of wildfire through dry grass, leaping from settlement to settlement, from temple to temple, until there was scarcely a corner of that troubled world that had not heard the name of the boy who dreamed of a golden god, the boy the rains had welcomed, the boy who seemed to carry within him the answer to questions Colchis had been asking for generations without ever quite finding a satisfactory response. Pilgrims began traveling great distances simply to hear him speak, to stand within the sound of his voice for even a few moments, hoping perhaps that some fragment of his certainty might settle upon them as well, easing the restless uncertainty that so many carried within their own hearts. And yet, for all this devotion gathering around him like clouds gathering before a storm, for all the power quietly accumulating in his hands with each passing season, Lorgar himself remained driven not by ambition in the way Corfairan perhaps hoped, nor by any simple desire for influence or comfort or security. He remained driven by something far more restless, far more demanding, something that never quite let him rest even amid the adoration of thousands. Long before he ever stood before the Emperor, long before he understood what he truly was or where he had come from, or what destiny had been quietly assembling itself around him since the moment his capsule first fell from the sky, his entire existence circled back, again and again, with the patient persistence of a tide returning to shore, to a single unanswered question, the same question that would shape every decision of his long and consequential life, every triumph and every tragedy, still waiting for him in the years ahead. What, in this vast and uncertain galaxy, was the true purpose of existence? What deserved a soul's devotion, completely and without reservation? What single truth, if any existed at all, could finally still the restless searching that had defined him since before he could properly speak? It was a question Colchis itself could never fully answer, no matter how many prophecies it offered him, no matter how many faiths competed for his loyalty, no matter how many tribes united beneath his growing influence, or how many slaves found new purpose in following him. The world that raised him could give him devotion, could give him followers beyond counting, could give him a title spoken with something close to worship across its dusty plains and crowded temples. But it could not give him certainty. The answer he sought, the truth that would finally satisfy the hunger that had burned within him since infancy, would not come from Colchis at all. It would arrive instead from somewhere far beyond the stars his world could see, carried on the wings of an arrival that would change not only Lorgar's life but the fate of his entire world, and in time, the fate of the galaxy itself. Finding his God. The day the Emperor came to Colchis was a day that Lorgar had, in some strange and unspoken way, been waiting for his entire life. He did not yet know the shape this arrival would take, nor the name that the wider galaxy gave to the figure descending through Colchis's dust-choked skies, but the moment he stood before him, the moment his eyes finally settled upon the towering presence that had come to claim this world as part of a far greater dominion, something within Lorgar recognized him instantly. This was no stranger arriving from beyond the stars. This was the golden figure who had walked through his dreams since infancy, the radiant presence he had glimpsed again and again in sleep without ever being able to hold the memory of his face. Here, standing before him in flesh and light, was the very being his visions had promised would come. For most who witnessed the Emperor's arrival on the worlds of the Great Crusade, the moment carried a different weight entirely. Many saw a conqueror, a ruler of unimaginable power who had come to bring their world into compliance, whether they welcomed that fate or resisted it with every weapon they could gather. Others saw a liberator, a figure who promised order after generations of chaos, unity after centuries of fractured rule. But Lorgar saw something else, something that none of his brothers, scattered across their own worlds and their own first meetings with their father, would ever quite understand in the same way he did. Lorgar did not see a ruler standing before him. He saw a god. It was not a conclusion he arrived at slowly, through careful reasoning or hesitant doubt, the way a philosopher might weigh evidence before committing to a belief. It was immediate, total, and unshakable, the kind of certainty that years of prophetic dreams had been quietly preparing him to feel, the instant the right figure finally appeared before him. Where the Emperor saw himself, by his own insistence, as nothing more than a man, however gifted, however singular his birth and purpose, Lorgar simply could not accept this. Everything in his life, every dream, every vision, every restless year of searching for some truth large enough to finally answer the question that had consumed him since childhood, had led him to this single moment. To believe the Emperor was merely a man would have meant unraveling the entire structure of meaning Lorgar had built around his own existence. And so he did not believe it. He looked upon his father and saw divinity made flesh, and from that moment forward, nothing the Emperor said or did would ever fully convince him otherwise. His devotion, once formed, was not the cautious or conditional loyalty that some of his brothers offered their father, a loyalty built on respect for the Emperor's vision or gratitude for the purpose he had given them. Lorgar's devotion was genuine in a way that ran far deeper than ordinary loyalty, absolute in a way that left no room for doubt or reconsideration. He did not love the Emperor as a son loves a father, though that love existed within him as well. He worshipped him, with the same fervor and the same complete surrender of self that the most devout priests of Colchis had once given to gods that Lorgar now understood, with sudden and painful clarity, to be nothing more than shadows and approximations of the one true divinity finally standing before him. This devotion shaped everything that followed in Lorgar's understanding of his own purpose, of the Great Crusade itself, and of what humanity truly required if it was to survive and flourish among the stars. While so many of his brothers saw the crusade in terms of territory reclaimed, enemies subdued, and the steady expansion of imperial control across a fractured galaxy, Lorgar saw something more. He came to believe, with the same unwavering conviction he brought to everything else, that humanity needed faith every bit as much as it needed conquest, that armies and warships alone could never hold an empire together across such vast distances without something deeper binding its peoples in common purpose. Conquest could claim a world. Only faith, he believed, could keep it. It was this conviction that led him, in the years that followed his first meeting with the Emperor, to begin composing poetry and religious writings in his father's honor, works meant to capture in language what his own heart had recognized the instant the Emperor first appeared before him. These were not idle hobbies, scraps of verse dashed off in quiet moments between campaigns. They were acts of devotion in their own right, careful and deliberate attempts to give voice to a truth Lorgar felt the rest of the galaxy was failing to properly recognize. He wrote of the Emperor's radiance, of his purpose stretching back to the dawn of humanity itself, of a divine plan unfolding across the stars that only Lorgar, perhaps, among all his brothers, seemed able to fully perceive and articulate. He composed hymns meant to be sung, prayers meant to be spoken in quiet reverence, verses that wove together the old theological instincts of Colchis with this new and overwhelming object of devotion that had finally answered the question Lorgar had carried since infancy. The Emperor himself, by most accounts, received these tributes with something closer to discomfort than gratitude. He had built his entire vision for humanity's future upon reason, upon science, upon the deliberate rejection of the superstition and blind faith that he believed had held humanity back for so many dark and fractured centuries before his rise. A son who insisted on worshipping him as a literal god, sat uneasily within that vision, a contradiction the Emperor could not simply ignore yet seemed unwilling, in those early years, to confront directly. But Lorgar, wrapped in the warm and total certainty of finally having found what he had searched for his entire life, scarcely noticed his father's discomfort, or perhaps simply could not bring himself to believe that discomfort meant what it so plainly did. He had found his God. He had found the answer to the only question that had ever truly mattered to him. And for a time, in the bright and hopeful early years of the Great Crusade, that certainty was enough to carry him forward into the stars, his faith burning steadily ahead of him like a beacon lighting the way toward whatever destiny still waited. The Word-bearers. Before the galaxy came to know them by the name they would carry through every chapter of their long and troubled history, the 17th Legion existed under a far simpler title, one that gave little hint of the strange path they would eventually walk. They were called the Imperial Heralds, a name befitting a force whose original purpose was as straightforward as any legion could claim. They were not yet shaped by Lorgar's hand. They had not yet absorbed the particular fervor that would come to define them in the years ahead. They were simply soldiers, gathered together under the Emperor's banner, given a task that seemed, on the surface at least, entirely compatible with the secular and rational vision the Emperor had built his entire crusade upon. That task was the enforcement of the imperial truth, the great unifying doctrine the Emperor had carried with him across 1,000 worlds as the Great Crusade pressed steadily outward into the dark unknown. The imperial truth held, at its core, that humanity's future depended on casting aside the comforting lies of religion and superstition that had held so many worlds in ignorance during the long centuries of the Age of Strife. There was no place in the Emperor's vision for gods, for priests, for sorcerers who claimed power beyond the reach of reason and science. The Imperial Heralds existed to make this truth real, across the breadth of the crusade, moving from world to world with the grim and necessary work of destroying false religions wherever they found them, dismantling cults, burning down the temples of gods that existed nowhere but in the frightened imaginations of those who worshipped them, and rooting out sorcery in whatever twisted forms it had taken root during humanity's long isolation among the stars. It was unglamorous work in many ways, work that earned the Legion few of the grand victories that some of their brother legions claimed on more conventional battlefields, but it was work the Emperor considered essential to the survival of his vision for humanity's future. All of this changed the moment Lorgar was found. It is one of the great and quietly troubling ironies of the Great Crusade that the Legion charged above all others with the destruction of false faith should come to be led by the one Primarch among all 18 who believed, with total and unwavering conviction, in a faith of his own. Yet this was precisely what happened when Lorgar took command of the Imperial Heralds, and within a remarkably short span of time, the Legion that had once burned down temples in the name of cold reason began transforming, slowly and then with gathering speed, into something the Imperial truth had never intended to produce. They became, under his guidance and in his image, the Word-Bearers, a name that announced plainly and without apology exactly what kind of Legion they had become. Where the Imperial Heralds had once been soldiers first and little else, the Word-Bearers under Lorgar's leadership became something closer to a militant priesthood, an army built not merely around tactics and discipline but around ritual, ceremony, and devotion, in equal and inseparable measure. Their barracks filled with chant. Their banners bore not only the marks of military honor but symbols heavy with theological meaning, drawn from the deep wells of scripture and prophecy that Lorgar had studied since childhood on Colchis. Where other legions trained relentlessly for the precise mechanics of war, refining their battlefield efficiency until it approached something close to perfection, the Word-Bearers spent at least as much of their time and energy on rites of devotion, on ceremonies that honored the Emperor not as a commander to be obeyed but as a god to be worshipped. Battle, for the Word-Bearers, became almost a secondary concern, a necessary expression of their faith rather than the central purpose around which their entire existence revolved. This shift in priorities reshaped not only how the Legion trained and organized itself but how it conducted the compliance campaigns that formed the daily business of the Great Crusade. Where many legions approached a newly discovered world with the straightforward calculus of conquest, weighing resistance against force and applying whatever violence proved necessary to bring that world into the Imperium's fold, the Word-Bearers approached compliance from an entirely different angle. For Lorgar and his Legion, conversion came first, and conquest, when it came at all, came only after. They arrived on a world not simply to subdue it but to persuade it, to win over its people through sermon and scripture and the sheer persuasive force of conviction before ever resorting to the more brutal tools of war that other legions reached for almost immediately. This preference revealed itself most clearly in the choice the Word-Bearers so often made between preaching and extermination. Where a legion focused purely on efficient compliance might simply destroy a population too resistant or too inconvenient to be worth the effort of negotiation, the Word-Bearers under Lorgar's command consistently chose the slower, more patient path of persuasion first. They sent forth their chaplains and their preachers, ahead of their warriors wherever circumstances allowed, hoping to win hearts and minds before a single shot needed to be fired, believing, as Lorgar himself believed with unshakable certainty, that a world converted through genuine faith would prove a far stronger and more lasting addition to the Imperium than a world merely beaten into submission through force alone. There was, in this approach, a kind of compassion that some other legions lacked entirely, a willingness to see the populations they encountered not merely as obstacles to be cleared but as souls to be won. Yet this same compassion, this same patient insistence on conversion before conquest, came at a considerable cost when measured against the grand and unforgiving timetable of the Great Crusade itself. The Imperium's expansion across the galaxy was, at its heart, a race against time, a desperate effort to reclaim as much of humanity's scattered dominion as possible before whatever dangers lurked in the dark between the stars could gather themselves against an empire still in the process of being built. Every world that took weeks or months longer to bring into compliance because the word-bearers insisted on preaching before fighting was a world that drew resources and attention away from the wider effort, a delay that other legions, pressing forward with brutal efficiency, simply did not allow themselves. Campaigns that might have concluded swiftly under a different legion's command instead stretched on, as Lorgar's preachers worked patiently to win over populations that proved, time and again, more receptive to scripture than to swords. This slowing of the crusade did not go unnoticed, and it created a quiet but persistent tension between Lorgar's legion and the wider campaign his father was so determined to complete. The Emperor had built an empire's worth of strategy around speed, around momentum, around the relentless forward press of conquest that left little room for the kind of patient theological persuasion the word-bearers had come to specialize in. And though Lorgar's legion remained, throughout this period, entirely and genuinely loyal to the Emperor and to the crusade he led, loyal in a way that none could honestly question, the very methods through which they expressed that loyalty increasingly stood at odds with the secular and rational vision their father had spent his entire existence trying to build. It was a contradiction that grew sharper with each passing campaign, each world brought into compliance through sermon rather than swift conquest, each victory celebrated with rites and ceremonies that would have looked, to any objective observer, indistinguishable from the very religious devotion the imperial truth had been created to eliminate. The word-bearers fought beneath the Emperor's banner and swore themselves to his cause without reservation, yet in nearly everything they did beyond the simple fact of their loyalty, they embodied precisely the kind of faith-based thinking their father had dedicated his life to stamping out across every world the crusade touched. They preached devotion in his name while he insisted there was nothing divine to devote oneself to. They built rituals around his image while he maintained, again and again, that he was nothing more than a man, however extraordinary his gifts and however vast his ambitions for humanity's future. For a time, this contradiction remained largely unspoken, tolerated perhaps because the word-bearer's loyalty was never in doubt, and because Lorgar's genuine devotion to the Crusade's broader goals, however strangely expressed, still served the Emperor's wider purpose of reclaiming humanity's scattered dominion among the stars. But contradictions of this magnitude rarely remain quiet forever, and the seeds of a far deeper conflict, one that would eventually consume Lorgar and his legion entirely, had already been planted in these early years, growing slowly beneath the surface of every sermon preached and every ritual performed in the Emperor's name, waiting only for the right moment, and the right wound, to finally break through into the open. The book that changed humanity. Of all the works Lorgar produced during those long years of preaching and devotion, none would prove as consequential, nor as quietly explosive, as the single text that would eventually outlast him, outlast the Great Crusade itself, and outlast even the heresy that followed. It was called the Lectitio Divinitatis, and though it began its existence as little more than a written expression of the conviction Lorgar had carried since the moment he first stood before the Emperor on Colchis, it would go on to become something far larger than any single man's belief, however fervently held. The Lectitio Divinitatis was not a battle plan, nor a treatise on strategy or conquest, the kind of work one might expect from a Primarch leading a legion through the long campaigns of the Great Crusade. It was scripture, composed with the same care and craft Lorgar had once poured into the poetry and hymns he wrote in his father's honor, but expanded now into something more complete, more deliberate, more dangerous in its implications. Within its pages, Lorgar set down in plain and unflinching language the belief that had shaped every decision of his life since childhood. He proclaimed, without hesitation or qualification, that the Emperor of mankind was no mere ruler, no simple product of extraordinary genetics and singular ambition. He was divine. He was a god walking among mortal men, and humanity owed him not merely obedience, but worship, the same total and unreserved devotion that Lorgar himself had given so freely since the day the Rains had first welcomed him into the world. It was a remarkable thing to commit to writing, given everything the Emperor had built his entire vision around. The imperial truth that the Great Crusade carried from world to world insisted, again and again, that humanity's salvation lay in reason, not faith, in science, not superstition. For Lorgar, the very Primarch whose legion had once existed to tear down false religions across the breadth of the Crusade, to put his name to a work proclaiming his own father a literal god, was to contradict the foundational doctrine of the empire he had sworn his life to building. He understood this contradiction. He had lived inside it for years already, watching his word-bearers preach and ritualize their way through compliance campaigns while the rest of the crusade marched forward under the banner of cold reason. The Lectitio Divinitatis was simply the moment that contradiction finally found its fullest and most permanent expression, set down in ink rather than left to live only in sermons and battlefield rites. The reception it received was every bit as harsh as Lorgar might have feared, had he allowed himself to fear anything at all in those years of total conviction. The work was condemned, swiftly and without much patience for the nuances of Lorgar's theological reasoning. It stood as precisely the kind of superstition the Crusade existed to eliminate, dressed up in scripture and reverence, but no different, in the eyes of its critics, from the false gods and empty rituals the imperial heralds had once burned from 1,000 worlds. The condemnation cut deeply, not least because it came from quarters Lorgar had hoped might understand, might even share in some measure the certainty he had carried since his earliest visions of a golden god. Instead, he found himself and his work cast as an embarrassment, a contradiction the wider Imperium would have preferred to quietly set aside. And yet here lies the strange and almost unbearable irony that history would only reveal across the span of 10,000 years still waiting in the future. The Lectitio Divinitatis, condemned and dismissed in its own time, did not simply vanish into obscurity as its critics no doubt hoped it would. It survived, quietly at first, passed between believers who had found something in its pages worth preserving even against the weight of official condemnation. And in the long centuries that followed the heresy, after the Emperor's fate had been sealed and the galaxy had been remade by grief and war, it was this same condemned text, this same proclamation of divinity that had once seemed so heretical, that would become the foundation stone of the imperial cult, the vast and unshakable religion that would come to dominate every corner of the Imperium for 10,000 years and more. The book Lorgar wrote in the fullness of his earliest devotion would outlive empires, outlive doubt, outlive even the bitter heresy his own faith would eventually help ignite, becoming at last the very thing he had always believed it should be. Monarchia. There comes a moment in the life of every devoted believer when devotion is tested, when the God they have given everything to must either affirm that devotion or reject it utterly, and there is rarely any middle ground to be found in such a reckoning. For Lorgar, that moment arrived not on some distant battlefield, not in the heat of compliance or the chaos of war, but in the quiet and terrible aftermath of a decision the Emperor had been weighing for years, a decision born of frustration that had finally, after so long, hardened into something resembling resolve. The Emperor had watched his son's legion drift further and further from the imperial truth with each passing campaign, had watched the Lectitio Divinitatis spread its quiet heresy across worlds that should have known only reason, and at last he decided that an example needed to be made. Not of some minor cult or forgotten tribal superstition, but of his own most devoted son, the one Primarch among all 18 who had given him not merely loyalty but outright worship. The city the Emperor chose for this lesson was Monarchia, and to understand the weight of what was about to be destroyed, one must first understand what Monarchia represented to Lorgar and to the legion he had shaped in his own image. It was not merely a city in the ordinary sense, not simply another settlement raised on some compliant world to house soldiers and administrators. Monarchia was, in every meaningful way, a monument to faith itself, a perfect city built with the express purpose of honoring the emperor as the god Lorgar had always known him to be. Its architecture rose in soaring spires meant to evoke divinity. Its streets were laid out according to principles drawn from scripture and sacred geometry, every angle and every avenue carrying theological meaning for those who understood how to read them. It was, in essence, the physical expression of everything the Lectitio Divinitatis had proclaimed in words, faith made manifest in stone and steel, a place where the word-bearers and the people of that world could gather to worship their God in a setting worthy of his glory. For Lorgar, Monarchia was not simply a fine achievement among many. It was perhaps the truest expression of his entire life's purpose, the closest he had ever come to building, with his own hands and the hands of those who shared his faith, a fitting temple to the divinity he had recognized the very first moment he stood before the emperor on Colchis. It was this city, this monument to total devotion, that the emperor chose to destroy. The destruction itself was swift and absolute, carried out with a finality that left no room for negotiation or appeal, no possibility that Lorgar might somehow explain his way back into his father's favor before the deed was done. Monarchia, the perfect city, the great cathedral to faith that Lorgar had poured so much of himself into creating, was leveled, its soaring spires brought down, its sacred geometry reduced to rubble and ash, and the kind of silence that follows only after everything has already been lost. It was not merely a military action. It was a statement, delivered in the clearest language the emperor knew how to speak, the language of total and irreversible destruction, aimed not at an enemy but at his own son's most cherished creation. And then came the humiliation that followed, a cruelty that cut even deeper than the loss of the city itself. Lorgar was forced to kneel. Not alone, not in some private reckoning between father and son where at least a measure of dignity might have survived the encounter, but publicly, before witnesses, before the watching eyes of the Ultramarines, the legion of his brother Guilliman, a legion that embodied everything ordered and rational and dutiful that the emperor had always hoped his sons would become. The entire word-bearers' legion knelt alongside their Primarch, thousands of warriors who had given themselves to the same faith Lorgar had given them, forced now to bow their heads in submission before another legion as the price of their devotion. It was a humiliation calculated with precision, designed not merely to punish but to demonstrate, beyond any possibility of misunderstanding, exactly how far Lorgar had fallen from his father's favor, and exactly how thoroughly that fall would be witnessed by his brothers. The emperor did not stop with the destruction of the city or the forced submission of an entire legion. He spoke as well, and his words carried a weight that no amount of rubble or ash could match. He denounced Lorgar's worship publicly, openly, without the slightest concession to the genuine devotion that had inspired it. He made clear, in terms that left no room for reinterpretation, that the faith Lorgar had built his entire existence around was not merely mistaken but dangerous, a betrayal of everything the imperial truth was meant to represent, a contradiction so severe that it warranted the complete and humiliating destruction of the city built to honor it. Every word landed not as correction but as rejection, the kind of rejection that does not merely criticize an action but condemns the heart from which that action sprang. For Lorgar, kneeling there amid the ruins of Monarchia, surrounded by the wreckage of everything he had built, and watched by brothers who had never shared his particular devotion, something far larger than a city was being destroyed. Monarchia had been stone and steel, replaceable in theory, however irreplaceable it felt in that terrible moment. But the destruction reached far beyond the physical city into something Lorgar had never thought to question, something that had formed the very foundation of his understanding of reality since the moment the Rains had welcomed him into the world. He had built his entire existence, every belief, every choice, every word he had ever written or preached, around the certainty that the Emperor was divine, that his devotion was not merely permitted but precisely what his God desired and deserved. now that certainty lay in ruins every bit as complete as the ruins of the city itself. If the Emperor was truly a god, why would a god reject the worship offered to him with such total sincerity? If he was not a god, then what had Lorgar's entire life been built upon? There was no comfortable answer waiting in either direction, only the terrible vertigo of a man discovering that the ground beneath his feet had never been as solid as he believed. This was perhaps the cruelest irony of everything that happened at Monarchia. Lorgar was not some distant or half-hearted son, offering token loyalty while privately pursuing his own ambitions. He was, by every honest measure, the son who loved his father most completely, who had given more of himself to that love than any of his brothers had ever offered, who had built cities and written scripture and reshaped an entire legion in service of a devotion he believed with his whole being, to be both true and righteous. And it was precisely this son, the one who had given everything, who found himself rejected most completely, denounced before witnesses, his life's great achievement reduced to rubble by the very hands he had worshipped without reservation. There is a particular kind of pain reserved for those whose love is met not with indifference but with active and public rejection, and it was this pain that Lorgar carried away from Monarchia, deeper and more lasting than any wound a blade might have given him. In the years that followed, many would come to see Monarchia as the precise moment when everything began to turn, the hinge upon which Lorgar's entire future swung from devoted son toward something far darker and more dangerous. It was not merely an event in his life. It became the defining turning point of his existence, the injury that never fully healed, the humiliation that festered quietly beneath every action he took from that day forward. Other Primarchs experienced their own conflicts with their father, their own moments of doubt or disagreement, but none carried an injury quite like this one, a rejection so total and so public that it left Lorgar searching, with the same desperate hunger that had once driven him to find his god, for some new truth large enough to fill the void Monarchia had carved into him. He would find that truth eventually, though it would lead him somewhere far darker than Colchis had ever imagined possible, somewhere his father's denunciation had perhaps, without ever intending it, set him irrevocably on the path toward. The search for the primordial truth. In the aftermath of Monarchia, the word-bearers did what their father had demanded of them, or at least they appeared to. They bowed their heads. They accepted the censure leveled against them with the outward dignity of soldiers who understood that discipline, however painful, was the price of belonging to something larger than themselves. They turned away from the open devotion that had defined them for so long, set aside the most visible expressions of their faith, and threw themselves into the work of the Great Crusade with a speed and aggression that surprised those brothers who had previously criticized their slow and ceremony-laden approach to compliance. To the watching Imperium, it seemed as though the lesson of Monarchia had been received and understood, as though Lorgar's legion had at last been brought back into line with the secular vision the Emperor had always intended for them. It was perhaps the greatest deception the 17th Legion ever practiced, and they practiced it with a patience and a thoroughness that would have been remarkable in any context. The penitence was real in its outward form, genuine enough in its surface details to satisfy those who chose to look no further, and many chose not to look further, content to believe that the problem had been solved, the wayward son corrected, the contradiction resolved. But beneath the surface, in the quiet spaces between campaigns and compliance actions, something very different was taking shape, something that had nothing to do with penitence and everything to do with the wound Monarchia had carved into Lorgar so deeply that no amount of outward discipline could reach it or begin to heal it. Lorgar was searching. He had always been searching, since before he could properly name the hunger that drove him. But the search that began after Monarchia was different in character from the one that had come before. Before, he had searched with hope, with the open and generous curiosity of a man who genuinely believed that what he was looking for was out there waiting to be found, and who expected, perhaps naively, that finding it would bring him peace. The search that began in the ruins of his perfect city was driven by something colder, something rawer, something that had more in common with bitterness than hope. He was no longer simply looking for truth. He was looking for beings that actually desired worship, beings that would not reject the devotion he had always had so much of to give. The Emperor had made his feelings on the matter perfectly plain. If the Emperor would not receive his worship, then perhaps there were other powers in the galaxy that would, and perhaps those powers deserved more careful attention than he had previously given them. The path his search began to take led him back, almost inevitably, toward Colchis. Not the physical world itself, though its influence had never truly left him, but the deeper current of belief that had run beneath Colchis's surface in ways that even Lorgar, for all his years of theological study on that world, had perhaps never fully explored. The old Colchisian faith, the tradition that had predated even the covenant that Corferan had once served as a priest, carried within its strands of something ancient and genuinely dark, references to powers older than any god humanity had yet named, forces that lurked at the edges of scripture in terms deliberately obscured, as though those who had first written them down had understood that the things they were describing were not meant to be approached directly or carelessly. In the years before Monarchia, Lorgar had looked past these darker strands, absorbed in the simpler and more consuming task of worshipping the golden god he believed he had found in the Emperor. Now, with that faith shattered and the bitterness of rejection burning steadily within him, he found himself returning to those obscured passages with new eyes, reading them not as embarrassing remnants of a more primitive theology but as signposts pointing toward something that had been there all along, patient and waiting, beneath every faith Colchis had ever produced. He did not pursue this new direction alone, nor did he expose it openly to a legion still performing its careful theater of penitence for any watching eyes. Instead he turned to the two men who, of all those surrounding him, were best equipped both to understand what he was reaching toward and to help him reach it without alerting the wider Imperium to what was truly happening. He turned to Corferan, his oldest guardian, the man who had shaped his earliest understanding of faith and power and their inseparability, and who had always possessed a relationship with the darker currents of Colchisian belief that went somewhat beyond what he had ever made fully explicit to his adopted son. And he turned to Erebus, the first chaplain of the Word-Bearers, a man of formidable intelligence and equally formidable patience, who had for some time been moving through shadows that Lorgar was only now beginning to properly perceive. Together, Corferan and Erebus became the architects of a transformation so gradual and so carefully concealed that it proceeded for years, before any outside the Legion began to suspect what was truly occurring within its ranks. Quietly, methodically, with the same patient conviction that the Word-Bearers had once brought to the work of converting worlds through sermon rather than sword, they began spreading chaos worship throughout the Legion. Not all at once, not through open declaration or sudden reversal, but through the slow and deliberate introduction of new rites layered beneath the existing ceremonial structures of the Legion, through the careful selection of which warriors were ready to hear certain truths, and which were not yet prepared, through the gradual replacement of devotion to the Emperor with devotion to powers older and stranger and far more willing to receive what was offered to them. The transformation was as much a work of patient theology as it was of conspiracy, and in this sense it was entirely fitting that it should be the Word-Bearers who carried it out, a legion that had always understood the power of belief to reshape individuals and communities from the inside. The influence did not stop at the borders of the 17th Legion's own ranks. Erebus in particular moved further afield than his own warriors, carrying the seeds of what was coming, into the wider structure of the Space Marine legions themselves through the introduction of warrior lodges, informal brotherhoods that spread through legion after legion, like quiet roots growing beneath the surface of a garden whose gardeners noticed nothing unusual until the damage was already done. These lodges presented themselves on the surface as simple fellowships, bonds of brotherhood and mutual support of the kind that warriors separated from ordinary human life naturally sought out. In practice, they served a very different purpose, creating networks of influence and divided loyalty that ran quietly alongside the official structures of obedience, connections that could be activated when the moment finally came to make use of them. It was careful work, and dangerous, and it was carried out with a thoroughness that only became fully apparent when it was far too late to undo. While Corfairan and Erebus prepared the Legion and extended its hidden influence outward, Lorgar himself went somewhere none of them could fully follow. He undertook a pilgrimage, though pilgrimage is perhaps too gentle a word for what it actually entailed. He crossed the boundary between the material galaxy and the realm beyond it, the place that ordinary understanding called the warp, but that Lorgar, approaching it now with the full weight of his theological instincts and his restless hunger for fundamental truth, was beginning to understand as something far more significant than a navigational medium or a source of psychic power. He went into the deep warp not as a navigator charts a course or as a psyker reaches for power, but as a pilgrim approaches a holy place, with the intention of seeing what truly lay there and returning with an understanding that no text or tradition had yet fully articulated. What he found there, in that vast and churning ocean of emotion and psychic energy that pressed against the material universe from a direction ordinary senses could not properly perceive, was something that struck him with the same immediate and total recognition he had felt the very first moment he stood before the Emperor on Colchis. He called what he found the primordial truth, a name that said everything about how he received it, not as a disturbing discovery but as a revelation, the final answer to the question he had been asking since infancy finally made plain in all its terrible clarity. The primordial truth, as Lorgar came to understand it and to preach it in the years that followed, was this: chaos was not, as its name might suggest, simply a force of destruction and disorder to be opposed or contained or kept at a careful distance. It was the fundamental reality of existence itself, the genuine and unalterable foundation upon which everything in the material universe rested, whether the inhabitants of that universe chose to acknowledge it or not. The gods of chaos, those vast and ancient entities that moved through the warp with a power and a presence that dwarfed anything the material galaxy had produced, were not aberrations or corruptions of something better and purer. They were real in the deepest possible sense, more real perhaps than the material world itself, which was in some ways only a thin and temporary film stretched across the surface of the warp's endless depth. The Emperor had built his entire vision on the denial of this truth, on the insistence that the warp was nothing but a tool and that its inhabitants were nothing worth worshipping. Lorgar had found the evidence that this denial was not merely mistaken but willfully, catastrophically blind. This revelation did not come to Lorgar alone. His pilgrimage into the warp produced something else, something physical and permanent, a sign of what was now possible for those willing to open themselves completely to the powers that dwelt in that realm. From among the warriors who accompanied him on the pilgrimage, there emerged a group that would become known as the Gal Vorbak, a name drawn from the oldest dialects of Colchisian scripture and meaning, in loose translation, the Blessed Sons. They were the first of their kind in all the legions, space marines who had allowed the entities of the warp to enter them fully, whose bodies had become vessels for powers from beyond the material universe, the first possessed warriors in the history of the Great Crusade, though they would not be the last. The Gal Vorbak were changed utterly by what they had accepted into themselves, transformed into something that was no longer entirely human and no longer entirely Astartes but something stranger and more fearful than either, a living demonstration that the boundary between the material world and the warp was not as fixed or as final as the Emperor had insisted it was. Lorgar looked upon the Gal Vorbak and did not see abominations, though that was precisely what those who later encountered them without his theological framework would call them. He saw proof. He saw living evidence that the primordial truth he had discovered was real, that the powers of the warp were not simply forces to be harnessed and discarded but genuine presences capable of entering into a relationship with mortal beings, of sharing themselves with those willing to receive them completely. Where the Emperor had offered his son's purpose without worship and denied the very existence of the divine, the powers of the warp offered something entirely different, something that called directly to everything Lorgar had always been, a faith that was not merely permitted but actively, eagerly desired by the beings at its center. From these revelations, there grew in Lorgar a conviction that went beyond anything he had believed even in his most fervent years of devotion to the Emperor. He came to believe that faith itself, properly directed and deeply enough held, possessed the genuine power to reshape reality. This was not a metaphor or a philosophical position. He meant it literally, in the most concrete and material sense the word literal could carry. The warp was a realm shaped by emotion and belief and the collective psychic weight of every mind in the galaxy, and the gods that inhabited it had been made by that weight, fed and sustained by it across uncountable millennia. If faith could create gods, if the devotion of mortal beings could call into existence and sustain entities of such immeasurable power, then faith was not merely a comfort or a social bond or a tool for managing populations, the cynical assessment that those who disagreed with Lorgar had always tended toward. Faith was a force, perhaps the fundamental force underlying everything that existed, the engine by which reality itself could be bent and remade by those who wielded it with sufficient conviction. This understanding transformed Lorgar in ways that went even deeper than Monarchia had transformed him, though in a different and stranger direction. Monarchia had broken him. The pilgrimage into the warp had rebuilt him, though into a shape that bore only a superficial resemblance to what he had been before. He returned from the warp still a philosopher, still a seeker of truth, still the same man who had grown up on Colchis asking the same fundamental question about the purpose of existence. But he returned with what he believed was finally an answer he could trust, an answer that the universe itself had provided in terms too large and too undeniable to be explained away or denounced by any voice, even his father's. He had gone into the deep places between existence and returned with the primordial truth burning within him, and now the only question remaining was what he intended to do with it. The answer to that question was already taking shape, quietly and inexorably, in the preparations Corfaron and Erebus had been making throughout his absence, in the warrior lodges spreading their hidden roots through legion after legion, in the Gal Vorbak standing changed and terrible and magnificent at his side. The penitent word-bearers, heads bowed and campaigns conducted with brutal efficiency, were no longer what they appeared to be. They had become something else entirely, a weapon aimed not at the enemies of the Imperium but at the Imperium itself, waiting only for the moment when the trigger was finally pulled. And Lorgar, the philosopher, the prophet, the man who had only ever wanted to find something worthy of his faith, had become the one who would pull it. The first Primarch to fall. Among all the sons of the Emperor, 18 Primarchs scattered across a galaxy still in the process of being remade, there was one who fell first. Not first in the sense of the first whose name history would associate most immediately with treachery, for that distinction would belong to another, to the great and golden Warmaster whose fall would cast the longest shadow across everything that followed. But first in the deeper and more consequential sense, first across the threshold between devotion to the Emperor and devotion to something else entirely, first to look into the dark heart of the warp and choose it freely, with open eyes and the full weight of a Primarch's intellect behind the choice. That distinction belonged to Lorgar, and he wore it not as a shame but as a title, the first of a new order rather than the last of an old faith. His embrace of chaos was not the stumbling fall of a man who lost his footing on uncertain ground, nor the desperate capitulation of someone broken beyond the point of resistance. It was a considered and deliberate act, the culmination of years of searching and suffering and theological reckoning, the moment when a Primarch who had spent his entire existence looking for something worthy of his faith finally decided that he had found it and was prepared to say so without qualification or concealment. He had knelt before the Emperor and called him God, and the Emperor had destroyed a city in response. He had gone into the warp and found powers that did not merely tolerate worship but were, in the most literal sense possible, made of it, sustained by it, inseparable from the faith of those who gave themselves to them. The choice, seen from inside Lorgar's understanding of reality, was not a difficult one. It was simply the next step, the inevitable conclusion of a journey that had begun on Colchis before he could properly walk. With his commitment made and the primordial truth burning within him as a settled and unshakable conviction rather than a question still seeking its answer, Lorgar took for himself titles that announced plainly what he had become. He called himself Archpriest of the Primordial Truth, a title that spoke to everything he had always been, the theologian, the philosopher, the man for whom faith was not incidental to existence but the very center around which everything else revolved. And he called himself Minister of Chaos Absolute, a title that said something different, something harder and colder, acknowledging not merely the devotional dimension of what he had embraced but the totality of it, the completeness of his surrender to a truth that admitted no halfway positions, no comfortable compromises with the secular world that had rejected him. These were not names chosen carelessly. They were the kind of names a man chooses when he intends the world to know exactly what he is and what he serves, when concealment has served its purpose and the time for open declaration has finally arrived. Yet for all the martial weight these titles might imply, for all that they announced a commitment to powers capable of reshaping the galaxy itself, Lorgar's methods remained, in their essential character, recognizably his own. He had never been a conqueror in the way that some of his brothers were conquerors, never defined himself through the simple application of overwhelming force against those who stood in his path. He was a philosopher and a preacher first, a man who had always understood, with a clarity his brothers rarely matched, that victory achieved through pure military force is a shallow and impermanent thing, easily reversed by the next army that arrives with a larger fleet and sharper blades. The victories that last, the changes that genuinely endure across centuries rather than simply until the next conflict, are won not on battlefields but inside minds, inside hearts, inside the structures of belief through which entire civilizations understand who they are, and what they owe their loyalty to. It was through these means, through belief and ritual, through carefully crafted doctrine and the slow patient work of infiltration, that Lorgar now moved against the Imperium he had once served. His corrupting influence spread not as an army advances, noisily and visibly, raising banners over conquered ground, but as a philosophy spreads, quietly and without obvious borders, carried from mind to mind by those already touched, taking root in the fertile soil of doubt and disillusionment and the simple human need for something worthy of devotion. The warrior lodges that Erebus had seeded through legion after legion continued their work, their members often unaware of the full extent of the network to which they belonged, drawn deeper by degrees into commitments they might never have accepted if presented with them all at once. The word-bearers moved through the wider crusade as soldiers, performing their compliance duties with the brutal efficiency that had silenced earlier criticism, while beneath that efficient surface, the work of transformation continued without pause. His greatest weapons, in the end, were not his legion's bolters or their blades, formidable as both undoubtedly were. They were ideas. They were questions planted at precisely the right moment in the minds of men already beginning to doubt. They were arguments constructed with the full sophistication of a Primarch who had spent a lifetime studying theology, philosophy, and rhetoric, arguments that could make the unthinkable seem not merely possible but necessary, that could reframe an act of treachery as an act of faith and make that reframing feel, to those who received it, like genuine illumination rather than manipulation. Lorgar had always known that the right words, delivered at the right moment to the right mind, could do what no army could accomplish, and now he turned that knowledge fully and without reservation toward the destruction of everything his father had built. The first Primarch to fall had always believed that faith could reshape reality. He was now engaged in the work of proving it. The architect of the heresy. History remembers the Horus heresy by the name of the War Master, and there is a certain logic to this, for it was Horus whose fall provided the spark, Horus whose name the traitor legions rallied behind, Horus whose golden reputation made his betrayal so devastating and so complete that the galaxy could scarcely find the words to describe what had happened when it finally did. But a spark requires more than the right name attached to it. It requires tinder, carefully laid and patiently prepared, long before the flame is ever brought close. It requires conditions shaped over years rather than moments, loyalties quietly undermined, doubts carefully cultivated, networks of influence woven through the fabric of the Imperium with a thoroughness that could only be achieved by someone who had been working toward this end for far longer than anyone outside a very small circle suspected. The spark was Horus. The tinder was Lorgar's work. Erebus and Cor Phaeron remained, throughout the long years of preparation, the two hands through which Lorgar's design moved most practically and most efficiently through the wider world. Where Lorgar himself operated at the level of theology and grand strategy, shaping the doctrinal framework within which everything else moved, his two lieutenants were the instruments through which that framework was given physical form, men whose patience and ruthlessness complemented each other in ways that made them extraordinarily effective agents of a cause most of those around them still had no idea existed. Erebus moved through the legions with the easy confidence of a well-respected chaplain, a man known across the crusade as a voice of martial piety and brotherhood, and it was this reputation that made him so dangerous, that allowed him to open doors that would have remained firmly closed to anyone whose true intentions were more openly apparent. Cor Phaeron worked closer to the word-bearers themselves, ensuring that the transformation of the Legion proceeded with the steady and unhurried thoroughness that Lorgar's plans required, that each new layer of chaos doctrine was embedded deeply enough to hold before the next layer was added above it. The warrior lodges that Erebus had introduced into legion after legion continued their quiet and corrosive work, and the damage they did to the bonds of loyalty holding the crusade together was, by the time anyone began to understand its full extent, already profound and largely irreversible. A legion is a community as much as it is an army, a brotherhood built upon shared purpose and mutual obligation, and the lodges exploited this with a sophistication that went beyond simple conspiracy. They offered their members something genuine: fellowship and frank conversation, and a space in which the frustrations and doubts that formal military hierarchy had no room for, could be expressed and shared among equals. And then, once those bonds were formed and that trust was established, they used them, gradually and carefully, to redirect the loyalties they had cultivated, away from the Emperor and toward something else, something the members of any given lodge often could not have precisely named, but that pointed, however distantly, in the direction Lorgar intended. It was through this network, through Erebus acting as the most direct instrument of the design, that Lorgar reached toward the event that would transform everything from careful preparation into open catastrophe. The corruption of Horus on the moon of Davin was not an accident, not a chance encounter between a vulnerable war master and powers that happened to be present at the right moment. It was an orchestrated event, prepared with the kind of meticulous care that only a mind like Lorgar's, patient and theologically sophisticated and utterly committed to the long view, could have arranged and sustained across the time and distance required to bring it to fruition. Erebus was there, as he so often was, at the critical moment, ensuring that Horus was brought to the Serpent Lodge on Davin, that he was exposed to the influence of a chaos entity at precisely the moment when his wound made him most vulnerable, that the circumstances surrounding his apparent death and miraculous recovery were shaped to produce the maximum possible transformation in the War Master's understanding of what he was and what he owed his loyalty to. Lorgar did not corrupt Horus because he wished to place his brother at the head of his holy war out of any simple calculation of military advantage, though Horus's capabilities as a commander were beyond question. He corrupted Horus because Horus was the one brother whose fall would carry the most weight, the one Primarch whose betrayal of the Emperor would be so shocking, so apparently impossible, that it would fracture the certainties of the entire Imperium at the deepest level, leaving millions of minds suddenly adrift in a world where the most trusted figure in human history had proven capable of treachery. And adrift minds, uncertain and frightened and searching for something solid to hold on to, were exactly the kind of minds most receptive to the doctrines Lorgar and his legion had been preparing to offer them. The word-bearers themselves had by this point been ready for open rebellion far longer than any other legion could claim. While the other traitor legions moved through the early stages of the heresy with the disorientation of men whose world had recently been upended, caught between old loyalties and new ones, between the habits of a lifetime and the demands of a choice just made, the word-bearers moved with the calm and purposeful efficiency of a force that had known this day was coming and had spent years ensuring they would be ready for it when it arrived. Their weapons were prepared. Their doctrine was embedded. Their warriors understood what they were fighting for and why, not merely as soldiers following orders but as believers acting in the service of a truth they had been given time to genuinely internalize. They were, in this sense, the most ideologically complete of all the traitor legions, the only ones who could honestly say that what they were doing represented a genuine and considered commitment to a fully articulated set of beliefs rather than a sudden and somewhat bewildering change of allegiance. When the opening violence of the heresy finally came, when the careful preparation gave way at last to open and irrevocable war, Lorgar was present at moments that would become among the most notorious in the history of that terrible conflict. He witnessed the Istvan massacres, the deliberate and systematic slaughter of legions whose loyalty to the Emperor had been deemed too complete to be converted and too dangerous to be left intact, and he watched the betrayals unfold with the complex understanding of a man who had planned for this, who knew what was necessary and had accepted the cost of it long before the cost became visible in terms of actual lives and actual blood. This was not a comfortable position to occupy, and there is no indication that Lorgar found it comfortable. But comfort had never been the standard by which he measured the rightness of an action. Truth was. And the truth as he understood it, required what was being done at Istvan, however terrible its execution. He was present too at a moment of a very different and stranger kind, one that reveals something important about the precise nature of Lorgar's commitment to the powers he served and the theological framework within which that commitment was contained. When Fulgrim, Primarch of the Emperor's children, underwent his demonic possession, surrendering his body and his identity to the entity that had been gradually consuming him from within, Lorgar did not react with the approval one might expect from a man who had himself pioneered the concept of possession with the Gal Vorbak and who had given his allegiance to the very powers responsible for what had happened to his brother. He reacted with anger, and the anger was genuine, rooted not in opposition to possession as a principle but in a deeply held conviction about how such things ought properly to be approached and undertaken. For Lorgar, the union of a mortal vessel with a warp entity was a sacred act, perhaps the most sacred act available to a being of flesh and blood, a moment of profound theological significance that deserved to be entered into with full awareness, full consent, and the kind of deliberate spiritual preparation that the Gal Vorbak had undergone on their pilgrimage. What had happened to Fulgrim was nothing like this. It was a violation, an ambush, a possession achieved through manipulation and the gradual erosion of a will that had never truly understood what was being done to it. To Lorgar, this was not a triumph of chaos but a spiritual obscenity, a desecration of something that deserved reverence, and his anger in that moment was the anger of a priest watching a sacred ritual performed carelessly by someone who had no real understanding of what they were handling. Even in his fall, even in his complete and willing service to the powers of chaos, Lorgar retained the theological precision that had always defined him, a precision that made him a more coherent and in some ways more genuinely dangerous figure than brothers whose relationship with chaos was defined by appetite and violence rather than doctrine and understanding. Throughout the heresy that followed, Lorgar operated in the manner that had always suited him best, and that had always, despite the frustration it sometimes caused his more militarily minded allies, proven extraordinarily effective in ways that battlefield victories alone could never achieve. He preferred manipulation to direct command, preferred the spread of doctrine to the claiming of territory, preferred the hidden shaping of events through influence and ideology to the straightforward deployment of force. While other Primarchs led their legions in great and terrible campaigns across the breadth of the galaxy, claiming systems and destroying fleets and pushing ever closer to terror in what was, at its surface level, a conventional military conflict, however unprecedented in scale, Lorgar worked at a different level, ensuring that what was being fought was understood by as many participants as possible on every side, not as a political rebellion or a military coup but as a holy war, a conflict over the most fundamental questions of what the galaxy was and what it deserved to become. This transformation, this reframing of the heresy from civil war into religious crusade, was perhaps the single most consequential thing Lorgar contributed to the conflict, more lasting in its effects than any campaign he led or any system his legion claimed. A civil war, however devastating, ends eventually, and its wounds, however deep, can in time begin to close, as the political and military conditions that produced it shift and the surviving parties find their way towards some new equilibrium. A holy war is a different matter entirely. A holy war does not simply end when one side defeats the other on the battlefield. It persists in doctrine, in scripture, in the devotion of those who carry its truths within them, long after the fighting has stopped, ready to be rekindled whenever the right conditions and the right preacher arrive together. By transforming the heresy into a war of faith, Lorgar ensured that even in defeat, even if every traitor legion were driven back and every traitor Primarch destroyed or exiled, the beliefs at the heart of the conflict would survive in forms that no military victory could fully extinguish. It is worth pausing, here in the long and terrible middle of the heresy that Lorgar did more than any other single figure to bring about, to consider what the conflict might have looked like without him, because the question reveals just how completely his contribution shaped its character. Without Lorgar, Horus's fall might still have occurred through some other mechanism, the warp being vast and patient and full of methods for finding the vulnerable places in a proud man's certainties. But Horus without Lorgar's theological framework would have been a rebel rather than a heresiarch, a brilliant commander pursuing power through military means rather than the chosen champion of a religious transformation intended to remake the fundamental character of the galaxy. The warrior lodges would not have existed, and the divisions they created within legion after legion would never have been opened. The word-bearers would have remained exactly what they appeared to be during their years of enforced penitence, soldiers performing their compliance duties with brutal efficiency, rather than the most ideologically prepared and theologically motivated force in the entire conflict. Without Lorgar, the Horus heresy might have remained a war between brothers. With him, it became something the galaxy had never quite seen before and would never be entirely free of again. A war for the soul of an entire species, fought on every front simultaneously, in the hearts of soldiers and the minds of civilians, and the doctrines of priesthoods still being written in the fires of a conflict that would not end for 10,000 years, and perhaps had not truly ended yet. Lorgar's ascension. There is a threshold that exists beyond the reach of ordinary ambition, beyond even the extraordinary ambition of a Primarch, a threshold that the powers of the warp offer to those who have served them with sufficient devotion and sufficient consequence, and that very few beings in the history of the galaxy have ever been found worthy to cross. It is the threshold between mortality and something else entirely, between the existence of a being made of flesh and blood and psychic potential and the existence of something that no longer requires flesh at all, something that has been taken up by the warp itself and remade within it as a permanent and self-sustaining presence, as real and as enduring as the gods it now serves. It is called ascension, and it is the ultimate reward the Chaos powers offer to their most favored servants, the moment when a life of devotion is finally answered with a transformation that makes all previous states of being seem, in retrospect, like mere preparation for what comes after. For Lorgar, ascension was not a surprise. It was not a sudden gift bestowed unexpectedly upon a servant who had not anticipated it, the kind of reward that catches a man unprepared and forces him to reckon quickly with what he has become. It was, instead, the next step in a journey he had been walking since the first time he dreamed of a golden god on Colchis, a journey whose direction had been fixed so long ago that what happened at his ascension felt less like a beginning than a completion, the final resolution of a story whose ending he had perhaps always been able to see from somewhere deep within himself, even if he could not have named it in those early years of searching. He had given everything to faith. Faith, in the end, gave him everything in return, though in a form that the boy who dreamed of a messiah on a dusty theocratic world could never quite have imagined. He became a demon Primarch, a being of the warp given permanent and terrifying form, no longer bound by the limitations of a body that could be wounded or exhausted or destroyed by the weapons of a material universe he had always only half belonged to anyway. The transformation elevated him beyond anything his brothers, whether loyal or traitor, could claim for themselves in purely physical terms, placing him in a category occupied by very few beings in the galaxy's long and violent history. But it was the nature of his ascension, more than the simple fact of it, that said the most important thing about who Lorgar was and had always been. He did not ascend in the service of a single chaos power, the way some favored champions were raised up by one particular god whose nature most closely matched their own. He ascended as a servant of chaos undivided, his devotion distributed equally and completely among all four of the great powers, his allegiance belonging not to any one aspect of the primordial truth but to the whole of it, the entire vast and churning reality of what lay beyond the material universe given a single and undivided object of worship. This was entirely consistent with everything Lorgar had always been. A man whose faith was rooted in theology rather than appetite, in the systematic pursuit of ultimate truth rather than the more immediate satisfactions of power or sensation or glory, would naturally find himself drawn toward the whole rather than the part, toward the comprehensive and the universal rather than the specific and the particular. His brothers who had fallen to chaos had often been claimed, whether they understood it or not, by whichever power most directly reflected the dominant characteristic of their own nature. Lorgar was different. He had studied the primordial truth too carefully, had thought too deeply about what the warp actually was and what the gods within it actually represented, to reduce his devotion to a single expression of a reality he understood to be far larger and more encompassing than any one of its aspects. Chaos Undivided was the only form of allegiance that matched the scale of his understanding, and so it was to Chaos Undivided that he gave himself completely, and it was Chaos Undivided that answered by raising him into something that the material galaxy could scarcely find adequate words to describe. The effects of his ascension on the Legion he had built and shaped and led through every stage of its long transformation were immediate and, in the most important ways, precisely what the word-bearers had always been moving toward. His influence over them did not diminish with his transformation into something no longer entirely present in the material universe in the way a physical commander must be present to lead. It deepened, spreading through the Legion not as orders passed down through a conventional chain of command but as something closer to doctrine, to the kind of pervasive theological certainty that does not require the constant physical presence of its author to remain effective because it has already been internalized by those who carry it. The word-bearers did not need Lorgar standing at the head of a column to know what he wished of them. They knew what he wished of them because they had been made, over the long years of his leadership, into an extension of his will at the deepest possible level, a legion whose identity and whose understanding of its own purpose was so completely shaped by his theology that serving that theology was simply what they were. What the Legion became in the wake of his ascension was the fullest expression of everything Lorgar had always intended them to be, the form they had been slowly approaching since the day Corpharan and Erebus first began laying the foundations of transformation within their ranks. Ritual sacrifice became a central and unashamed feature of their practice, offered to the powers of the warp with the same theological care and ceremonial precision that Lorgar had always brought to questions of faith and devotion, not the chaotic and indiscriminate bloodletting of warriors who simply enjoyed violence, but structured and deliberate acts of worship performed according to doctrine and invested with genuine theological meaning by those who carried them out. Demonic worship moved from the carefully concealed practice of a legion still performing penitence for the benefit of watching eyes, to an open and defining characteristic of everything the word-bearers did and everything they claimed to be. The mask that had been worn for so many years was no longer needed, and being no longer needed, it was discarded entirely, leaving the Legion standing exactly as Lorgar had always intended them to stand, openly and without apology, as the most devoted servants of the primordial truth in the entire galaxy. The unity that had always distinguished the word-bearers from other traitor legions, that quality of ideological coherence that Lorgar's theological leadership had built into their foundations over decades of careful work, found its most complete expression in the figure of the Dark Apostles, the preachers and priests who carried his will through the Legion as the primary vehicles of his continuing influence. These were not simply senior officers wearing theological titles as an affectation, as the chaplains of loyalist legions wore their black armor and their death masks, figures of ceremony within an organization primarily defined by other concerns. The Dark Apostles were the true commanders of the word-bearers in every meaningful sense, the men around whom their individual warbands and crusades of faith revolved, whose authority rested not on rank alone but on demonstrated theological understanding and genuine closeness to the powers they served. They preached. They performed the rites. They made the sacrifices and led the devotions and ensured that every action taken by the warriors under their command was understood not merely as military activity but as an act of worship, an expression of faith, a small piece of the larger holy war that Lorgar had set in motion and that would not conclude until the galaxy itself had been remade in the image of the primordial truth. And yet, for all the darkness of what the word-bearers had become, for all the blood and the ritual and the demonic presence woven through every aspect of their existence, they retained something that set them apart from virtually every other traitor force operating in the long aftermath of the heresy. They remained disciplined. They remained, by the standards of forces who had surrendered themselves to the entropic pull of chaos, remarkably centralized and coherent, a legion that still functioned as a legion rather than fragmenting into the independent warbands and competing factions that had consumed so many of their brother traitor formations in the centuries following the Emperor's wounding. Where other legions had been pulled apart by the individualistic and centrifugal nature of chaos, by the constant pressure of competing ambitions and the corrupting influence of powers that tend, over time, to dissolve the bonds of collective purpose in favor of personal glory, the word-bearers held together, bound by the same doctrinal unity that had always been their defining characteristic. It was Lorgar's final and perhaps most enduring gift to them, this coherence, this capacity for collective purpose that survived even the transformation of their Primarch into something no longer fully present among them. He had built them around belief rather than around his physical presence, and belief, properly embedded, is a far more durable foundation than any single leader's authority, however great. The word-bearers endured because what held them together was not simply loyalty to a man but loyalty to a truth, and truths, as Lorgar had always known, are considerably harder to kill than men. The Long War. The Siege of Terror was the moment toward which everything had been moving, the culmination of a war that had consumed the galaxy for years and cost more lives than any previous conflict in human history could claim to match. It was the moment when the traitor legions pressed against the walls of the Imperial Palace itself, when the Emperor and the War Master finally moved toward their inevitable and terrible reckoning, when the war that Lorgar had done more than any other single figure to architect and to shape, reached the point its architects had always been driving toward. And yet, according to some of the most persistent and carefully considered accounts of what occurred in those final days, Lorgar was not fully present for it. The accounts vary in their details, as accounts of events so enormous and so chaotic always do, but the thread that runs through the most credible of them suggests that Lorgar, possessed of a foresight that his long immersion in the currents of the warp had sharpened into something approaching genuine prophetic clarity, had seen enough of what was coming to make a decision that would strike some as abandonment and others as the most strategically significant choice of the entire war. He withdrew a substantial portion of his legion from the siege before its conclusion, pulling them back from the walls of the palace and the grinding and apocalyptic violence consuming everything within reach of those walls, and directing them instead toward the longer horizon he had always been better at seeing than most of his brothers. What precisely he foresaw remains a matter of theological debate within the word-bearers even 10,000 years later, a question his dark apostles return to with the same devotional intensity they bring to every difficult passage of sacred doctrine. Perhaps he saw Horus's death with sufficient clarity to understand that the siege, whatever its outcome on the day, would not be the end of anything that truly mattered. Perhaps he understood, with the theological sophistication that had always distinguished him from the more straightforwardly martial primarchs around him, that a war defined by faith could not be concluded by a single military engagement however titanic, that the heresy he had transformed into a holy war would require centuries and millennia of continuation rather than a single decisive moment at the walls of the Emperor's palace. Perhaps he simply saw that those who remained at the siege would be consumed by it, and that the legion he had spent his life building into the most doctrinally coherent and theologically prepared force in the galaxy was too valuable, too irreplaceable, to be spent entirely in the fires of a single day, however momentous. Whatever the precise content of his foresight, the decision it produced shaped everything that followed. The word-bearers who withdrew from Terra under his direction survived the disaster that engulfed the traitor cause in the siege's aftermath, survived with their numbers and their structure and their doctrinal unity substantially intact, and retreated into the eye of Terra, not as a shattered remnant fleeing a catastrophic defeat, but as a force that still understood its purpose and still possessed the means to pursue it. They carried their theology with them into the dark, and their theology told them, clearly and without room for despair, that what had happened at Terra was not the end of the Holy War but only the conclusion of its first great chapter. The war continued. It would always continue, until the galaxy itself had been remade according to the primordial truth, and one failed siege, however painful its immediate consequences, changed nothing about that fundamental fact. In the long centuries that followed the heresy's formal conclusion, Lorgar himself began to change in ways that his legion watched with a mixture of reverence and something that in a lesser organization might have been described as uncertainty. The Primarch who had once led compliance campaigns in person, who had stood before crowds on a dozen worlds and moved them to devotion with nothing more than his voice and the conviction behind his eyes, began to withdraw from the direct exercise of command with a gradual but unmistakable consistency. The battlefield appearances became less frequent. The personal interventions in the Legion's wars grew rarer, separated by longer and longer intervals of absence that his dark apostles filled with doctrine and devotion rather than with any open acknowledgement of what his withdrawal might mean. He had gone to Sicarus, a demon world deep within the Eye of Terror, a place where the boundary between the material universe and the warp had thinned to the point of near transparency, where reality itself bent and shimmered according to currents that flowed from the warp rather than from any natural law the material universe recognized. It was, in every meaningful sense, the appropriate dwelling place for what Lorgar had become, a being who no longer belonged entirely to the material world, who existed now at the intersection of flesh and warp in a way that made the normal distinctions between presence and absence, between here and elsewhere, considerably less fixed than they would be for a being who had never crossed the threshold of demonhood. On Sicarus he remained, not idle but no longer engaged with the galaxy in the direct and personal way his earlier life had been characterized by. He had become something closer to what he had always perhaps been moving toward. Not a commander, not a general, not even quite a leader in the conventional sense, but a source, a theological foundation from which everything the word-bearers did and believed continued to flow outward into the galaxy without requiring his constant physical presence to maintain its force. His guidance reached the Legion through doctrine rather than through orders, through the accumulated body of theological understanding he had spent his entire existence building and refining, which his dark apostles carried and interpreted and applied to every situation they encountered, with the confidence of men who had been trained not merely to follow instructions but to understand the principles behind them deeply enough to extrapolate correctly from them, in circumstances that their teacher hadn't directly addressed. This was the true measure of how completely Lorgar had succeeded in building what he intended to build, that the Legion he had shaped could continue to function as an expression of his will, even when that will was no longer being communicated directly, because the will had been so thoroughly embedded in the doctrine and the belief and the very identity of every warrior who bore the word-bearer's colors. The followers he had cultivated across decades of patient infiltration and careful theological seeding continued their work throughout imperial space, spreading into the cracks and the dark corners of an imperium that grew larger and more unwieldy with every passing century and therefore harder to keep clean of the influences Lorgar had spent so long learning to introduce into it. Chaos cults flowered on worlds that believed themselves safely distant from the eye of terror and the traitor forces within it, nurtured by preachers and missionaries whose connection to the word-bearers was often several steps removed from anything that could be easily traced or definitively proved. They operated through exactly the same methods that had proven so effective in the years before the heresy, the slow and patient work of conversion through doctrine and community and the exploitation of doubt, the gradual replacement of one set of beliefs with another until the replacement was complete enough that those who had undergone it often could not have identified the precise moment when it had happened. The word-bearers themselves continued to regard the heresy, not as a concluded conflict whose outcome had been settled at the Siege of Terror, but as an ongoing and fundamentally unfinished holy war, a war whose first great campaign had ended in a reversal that was painful but not decisive, that changed the immediate military situation without touching the theological reality that underlay it. This framing was not mere consolation, not the self-serving revision of a defeated force trying to find dignity in loss. It was a genuine and coherent theological position, entirely consistent with the doctrine Lorgar had built the Legion's entire understanding of itself upon, and it gave the word-bearers something that very few traitor forces operating in the long war after the heresy could honestly claim to possess. A reason to continue that went beyond simple survival or the pursuit of personal power, a reason rooted in genuine conviction that what they were doing mattered in a way that extended far beyond the outcome of any individual campaign or any particular century's balance of forces. As for Lorgar himself, he became, across those long millennia of the Long War, something that the galaxy found easier to discuss as a concept than to locate as a presence. He became mythical, in the most precise and least dismissive sense of that word, a figure whose reality was not seriously in doubt but whose direct engagement with the material world had become so infrequent and so removed from ordinary experience that stories about him took on the character of theological accounts rather than historical reports. He was spoken of in the word-bearer's scripture as a constant and sustaining presence, the primordial annunciator, the Urizen still, the wisest of the wise in a tradition that had grown enormously more complex and more dangerous than anything Colchis had originally given him the tools to imagine. He emerged from Sicarus only rarely, and when he did, those emergencies carried a weight entirely disproportionate to their frequency, moments that his legion received as something between a military intervention and a theophany, a god briefly made visible in the world he was still, patiently and in his own chosen time, working to remake. The long war ground on, across the centuries, as wars shaped by faith rather than by strategy tend to do, sustained by belief where material resources might long since have been exhausted, drawing its endurance from the same source Lorgar had always drawn his, from the simple and implacable conviction that what was true did not stop being true simply because the immediate military situation was inconvenient, and that a holy war, properly understood, does not end until its object is achieved. Lorgar had always played the longest game of any Primarch in the galaxy, and 10,000 years, as it turned out, was not long enough to reach its conclusion. The Dark Prophet. 10,000 years is a span of time that defeats ordinary imagination, a gulf so vast that the events at one end of it have become, by the time the other end is reached, something closer to myth than to history in the minds of those who were not there to witness them. Empires rise and collapse within such a span. Languages are born, flourish, and die. The very shape of civilizations changes beyond recognition, until those living at the far end of 10 millennia can look back at the beginning only through layers of interpretation and legend so thick that the original events are visible, if at all, only in the most distorted and fragmentary form. And yet, at the far end of those 10,000 years, in the turbulent and desperate age that the Imperium of mankind now struggles to survive, one of the figures who stood at the very beginning of that long catastrophe remains, not as a memory or a legend alone, but as a presence still capable of reaching into the material universe and touching it with consequences that those touched rarely see coming until it is too late to do anything about them. Lorgar remains. Demon Primarch of Chaos Undivided, the Urizen still, the primordial Annunciator, the philosopher who wanted only to find something worthy of his faith and found instead the patience to wait across the breadth of ages for the moment he has always believed is still ahead of him. He remains within the Eye of Terror, upon Sicarus, or in depths of the warp beyond what any material instrument could locate or describe, present in the way that beings who have crossed the threshold of demonhood are present, which is to say present in a manner that does not map neatly onto the ordinary distinctions between here and elsewhere, between active and dormant, between watching and withdrawn. The rumors that filter out of the Eye of Terror and into the wider Imperium through the fractured channels by which such information tends to travel are, as rumors of this kind always are, difficult to verify and impossible to dismiss entirely. The most persistent of them, repeated in the hushed and careful language of those who understand that the subject is not one to approach carelessly, suggest that Lorgar has emerged from something, a period of meditation or contemplation so deep and so extended that even by the standards of a being for whom centuries pass differently than they do for mortal minds, it represented a genuine withdrawal from engagement with the galaxy outside the warp's churning depths. Whether this emergence, if it is real, represents a renewed interest in the material universe or simply the natural conclusion of a period of reflection whose purpose none outside his closest councils can claim to understand, is not something the rumors resolve, and it is likely that this ambiguity is itself deliberate, a quality cultivated rather than accidental in a figure who has always understood the power of mystery as a theological tool. The day-to-day reality of the word-bearers in this age does not depend on Lorgar's direct presence, and has not depended on it for a very long time. The Dark Apostles who carry his will, through the Legion and outward into the galaxy are, in practical terms, the functioning leadership of everything the word-bearers do, across the breadth of the long war. Men of formidable theological training and equally formidable martial capability who operate with the confidence of commanders who understand their mission at the deepest possible level and require no moment-to-moment guidance to pursue it effectively. They preach. They lead their warbands into battle against the Imperium and its allies with the fervor of men who understand that every engagement is an act of worship as much as a military operation. They cultivate the cults that continue to spread through the darkness of Imperial space, tending them with the patient and expert attention that Lorgar himself first brought to the work of theological infiltration in those long years before the heresy. They are his voice in the galaxy, and they carry that voice with a consistency and a doctrinal precision that speaks to the enduring completeness of the foundation their Primarch laid beneath everything they are. The Legion they lead remains, by any honest assessment, one of the most genuinely dangerous forces operating against the Imperium in this late and desperate age, and dangerous in ways that go beyond the simple military threat posed by 10,000 Space Marines who have spent millennia refining the art of war. The word-bearers are dangerous because they are coherent, because the theological unity that Lorgar built into their foundations 10,000 years ago has proven, against every reasonable expectation, to be durable enough to survive the full span of the Long War without fragmenting into the competing factions and individual ambitions that have diminished so many of their brother traitor legions. They are dangerous because they are patient, capable of pursuing goals across timescales that would defeat any organization held together by simple military loyalty or personal ambition rather than genuine shared belief. And they are dangerous because they continue to do what Lorgar first taught them to do, not merely fighting the Imperium on battlefields where the outcome is measured in territory taken and enemies destroyed, but undermining it from within through the slow and careful work of doctrinal corruption that has always been their most effective and most difficult to counter capability. Among those who study the word-bearer's theology, who attempt to understand from the outside what Lorgar's Legion believes about its own purpose and its own future, certain threads of teaching recur with enough consistency to suggest that they represent something close to genuine doctrine rather than the variable speculation of individual dark apostles working in isolation from one another. Chief among these threads is the notion of a final hour of ascension, an event that the most sacred of the Legion's texts describe in terms that resist any simple or literal interpretation but that carry, beneath their deliberately obscure language, a consistent implication. The suggestion that what happened at the Siege of Terra, catastrophic as it was for the traitor cause in immediate military terms, was not the climax of the story Lorgar is telling but only the end of its first act. That there is a conclusion still ahead, a moment of transformation so complete and so fundamental that everything that has come before it, the heresy itself, the 10,000 years of the Long War, all the blood and the doctrine and the patient corrupting work of uncountable centuries, will be understood in retrospect as preparation for this single event. What precisely the hour of ascension entails, what form the transformation it promises would take, whether it concerns the word-bearers alone or something larger and more encompassing, humanity itself or the galaxy or the fundamental relationship between the material universe and the warp, the Legion's theology declines to specify with any clarity, and this reticence is itself almost certainly intentional. Lorgar has always understood that mystery is a theological instrument of enormous power, that a promise whose precise content remains undefined is in many ways more potent than one laid out in specific and verifiable terms, because it can mean to each believer whatever their deepest conviction tells them it should mean, and the hope it generates is therefore precisely calibrated to the individual who carries it. He has always been the most sophisticated theologian in the galaxy, and the deliberate ambiguity surrounding his long-term ambitions is a master practitioner's choice rather than an oversight or an omission. What those ambitions actually are, what Lorgar in the depths of Sicarus or the further reaches of the warp is genuinely working toward, remains one of the most consequential unanswered questions of the current age, because the answer, when it eventually makes itself known, will likely make itself known through events rather than through any announcement, through consequences already unfolding rather than through intentions declared in advance. He has always preferred to let the work speak for itself and to allow others to understand it only after it has proceeded far enough that understanding changes nothing. And yet, for all the darkness of what Lorgar has become, for all the blood and the corruption and the 10,000 years of war that his choices set in motion, there is an irony at the heart of his story so complete and so perfectly constructed that it seems almost too deliberate to have been produced by the simple chaos of historical events, though history does sometimes achieve this kind of terrible elegance without any author's conscious intent. The Emperor rejected Lorgar's worship. He destroyed the city built to honor him. He knelt his most devoted son in the dust before a watching legion and declared that faith itself was the enemy of everything humanity needed to become. He did all of this with the full authority of the most powerful human being who had ever lived, and he meant every word of it, genuinely and without reservation. And the Lectitio Divinitatis, the book Lorgar wrote in the fullness of his earliest and most innocent devotion, the work condemned in its own time as dangerous heresy, the scripture that proclaimed the emperor a god when the emperor himself insisted he was nothing of the kind, became the foundation of the imperial cult, the vast and all-encompassing state religion of the imperium of mankind, the faith upon which an empire of 1,000,000 worlds rests its deepest certainties, from which it draws, in its darkest hours, the will to continue existing against all rational expectation. The very institution the emperor built his entire philosophy in opposition to, the very surrender to faith and superstition and the worship of the divine that he had dedicated his extraordinary life to replacing with reason and science and the cold light of the imperial truth, now bears his own name and face at its center. Every prayer offered to the God Emperor of mankind in every one of those 1,000,000 worlds and in every warship and every outpost and every desperate last stand being made somewhere in the galaxy at this very moment is, whether those offering it know it or not, an echo of the devotion Lorgar first articulated in the words of a book written to honor a father who did not want to be honored in that way. There is no tidier summary of Lorgar's place in the history of the galaxy than this single fact. He set out to find something worthy of absolute faith, and in the process of that search, and through the long and terrible consequences of what his search led him to, he made his own father into the god he had always believed him to be, in the minds of billions who will never know his name or understand his role in shaping the faith they carry. He wanted the universe to have a theology. The universe, bending under the weight of 10,000 years of consequence, gave him one, though not quite the one he originally intended. More than any Primarch who ever lived, loyal or traitor, Lorgar understood and demonstrated a truth that the galaxy has been learning at enormous cost ever since he first stood before a crowd on Colchis and felt their certainty shift in response to his words. Belief is not a comfort or a weakness or a primitive remnant of a less enlightened age. Belief is a force, perhaps the most fundamental force available to mortal beings, capable of sustaining what logic alone would abandon, capable of destroying what armies alone could never reach, capable of persisting across 10,000 years of war and loss and the relentless grind of a conflict that has claimed more lives than any other in human history, without diminishing, without losing its essential character, without becoming anything other than what it was, the day a boy on a dusty, theocratic world, first dreamed of a golden god and decided, with the whole of himself, that the dream was real. The philosopher who wanted only to believe in something, and who reshaped the galaxy in the process of that search, remains in the dark beyond the eye of terror, patient as doctrine is patient, enduring as faith endures. Whatever he is waiting for, whatever the hour of ascension means in the depths of his ancient and extraordinary mind, he is waiting for it with the same absolute conviction he has carried since childhood. The conviction of a man who has never once, in all the long and complicated history of his existence, doubted that the truth he sought was real. And that finding it was worth every price that the galaxy required him to pay.